Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. In King's Landing, Tywin Lannister was sitting in his chamber with a glass of Dornish wine in one hand and a letter in the other. With him was sitting his advisors. After some time reading the letter and contemplating, he finally spoke up. Stark's bastard boy is growing up too fast, and now his power has increased again. This time he has started to build his empire even if he only occupies a small city now. I can see that it won't be long before he starts conquering others. It's like this with every second king. It would have been good if he has died back then. My intuition has been correct all along. Now I'll have to pull some strings down some favors and write some words here and there to Essos to make things difficult for this wolf cub. Although he has dragons, but they are just babies yet. Maybe we will be able to finish him. And if he still survives, then it's his luck, and we'll have to prepare early for his arrival in Westeros in the future. In Winterfell, Sansa Stark sat in her solar, embroidering a dire wolf onto a piece of blue silk while her septa droned on about proper deportment for young ladies. But her mind was elsewhere, focused on the letters that had been arriving from across the narrow sea, reports of her bastard brother's growing legend. Lady Sansa? Septa Mordane's voice cut through her reverie. You seem distracted today. I was thinking about Jon, Sansa admitted, setting down her needlework. At 13, she was beginning to understand the complexities of the world beyond Winterfell's walls, and the reports of her brother's transformation both thrilled and frightened her. Your bastard brother? The Septa's tone carried the disapproval of someone who believed bastards should know their place. What of him? The letters say he has dragons now, that he's freeing slaves and building an army. Sansa's voice carried a note of wonder that made the Septa frown. Do you think it's true? Wild tales from across the sea, Septa Mordane replied, dismissively. Dragons have been dead for 300 years. Your brother is likely just another sellsword captain, trading on the Stark name for coin and glory. But Sansa wasn't convinced. She remembered Jon from their childhood, quiet, serious, always watching and thinking. If anyone could tame dragons, it would be him. The thought filled her with a mixture of pride and unease. What did it mean for their family, if Jon had truly become something more than a bastard? Will he come home? She asked quietly. The Septa had no answer for that, and Sansa found herself staring out the window toward the crypts, where the old kings of winter slept. Somewhere out there, her brother was becoming a legend. She only hoped he would still be their Jon when all was said and done. In Pentos, Magister Ilio Mapatis reclined on silk cushions in his private garden, the morning air heavy with the scent of exotic flowers and the distant sounds of the city awakening. Before him, a collection of reports from across Essos painted a picture of a world in flux, with the young wolf of fire at the center of the storm. Remarkable, he murmured to himself, studying an account of Jon Snow's latest victory. The boy has learned to play the game with a master's touch. Perhaps it's time to make direct contact. The fat Magister had been watching Jon's rise with the calculating interest of someone who understood that chaos could be profitable for those clever enough to exploit it. The young Dragon Lord's crusade against slavery was disrupting established trade routes and creating opportunities for new arrangements that could be very lucrative for the right partners. But there was also danger in Jon's growing power. A man with dragons and an army of devoted followers was a wild card in the great game, capable of upsetting carefully laid plans and destroying profitable relationships. The question was whether Jon Snow could be controlled, or whether he had already grown too powerful to be anything but an enemy. Viserys grows more unstable by the day, Illyrio observed to his companion, a thin man with the pale features of a Lyseni. His jealousy of this wolf of fire consumes him. Perhaps it's time to arrange a meeting between the dragon princes. Let them be at peace or at war, and the second one is what I think will happen. The Lyseni smiled with the cold calculation of someone who had orchestrated many such meetings. And if the bastard proves stronger than the prince, then we'll have our answer about which dragon is worth backing, Illyrio replied. The game is changing, my friend. We must change with it, or be swept aside. The invitation arrived on silk parchment, sealed with the golden scales of House Mapatis. Jon Snow read it twice before setting it down on the oak table that served as his desk in Salt Shore's modest keep. The words were flowery in the manner of Pentoshi merchants, but the meaning was clear. Magister Illyrio Mapatis requested the honor of his presence for a feast celebrating the ancient friendship between Pentos and the Free Cities. It's a trap, Ser Gareth said bluntly, studying the invitation with the suspicion of a man who had survived too many betrayals. Rich magisters don't invite sellsword captains to their tables unless they want something. Of course it's a trap, Jon replied, stroking Balarion's neck as the black dragon perched on his shoulder. The creature had grown considerably in recent weeks, now nearly the size of a raven, with scales that gleamed like polished obsidian. The question is whether it's a trap we can turn to our advantage. The Thoros of Myr limped into the solar, his red robes dusty from the morning's training with the newer recruits. The priest had been pushing himself harder lately, as if trying to atone for the path his former squire was walking. Illyrio Mapatis is no mere merchant, Jon. He has fingers in every pie from here to Slaver's Bay. If he's interested in you, it's because he sees profit in your dragons. Then perhaps it's time he learned that dragons aren't for sale, Jon said quietly, his gray eyes reflecting the cold steel that had been growing stronger in recent months. The decision to accept the invitation had been inevitable from the moment Jon read it. The Golden Company was still 3 days out, and he needed every advantage he could gather. If that meant walking into a Magister's web, so be it. He had learned to navigate dangerous waters since leaving Winterfell. I'll take a small escort, Jon decided. Yourself, Ser Gareth, and Mira, the rest of our forces remain here to prepare for the Golden Company's arrival. And the dragons? Thoros asked, though he already knew the answer. Jon's smile was sharp as winter wind. They come with me. If Illyrio wants to see dragons, he'll get his wish. The journey to Pentos took 2 days by ship, sailing through waters that had once been dominated by Valyrian dragon lords. Jon stood at the prow of their vessel, a sleek galley captured from pirates months earlier, watching the ancient city grow larger on the horizon. Pentos was a marvel of architecture and commerce, its walls rising from the sea like a crown of gold and marble. The harbor bustled with ships from every corner of the known world, their holds filled with silk and spices, slaves and steel. It was beautiful and terrible, a testament to the wealth that could be built on human suffering. Magnificent, isn't it? Thoros said, joining Jon at the rail, and every stone of it paid for with blood and chains. Not for much longer, Jon replied quietly, his hand resting on Balarion's neck. The dragon had grown restless as they approached the city, sensing something in the air that made his scales ripple with suppressed flame. Their arrival had clearly been expected. A delegation waited at the docks, richly dressed servants bearing the golden scales of House Mapatis, flanked by guards in ceremonial armor that couldn't quite hide the steel beneath. At their head stood a thin man with a pointed beard and calculating eyes. Lord Snow, the man said with a bow that was precisely calibrated to show respect without subservience. I am Magister Illyrio's seneschal. My master awaits your pleasure at his manse. The journey through Pentos' streets was a carefully orchestrated display of wealth and power. Their escort led them through the merchant quarter, where gold flowed like water and slaves served wine from crystal goblets. Citizens lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the young dragon lord, their faces showing mixtures of curiosity, fear, and awe. But it was the dragons that drew the most attention. Aniridin and Ygritte rode on Jon's shoulders, their presence causing horses to shy and dogs to whimper. Whispers followed in their wake. Dragons, fire made flesh, the return of old Valyria. Jon felt the weight of their stares like a physical thing, and for the first time truly understood the power that came with being the last dragon lord in the world. Illyrio's manse was a palace in all but name, its gardens filled with exotic plants and its halls decorated with treasures from across the known world. The Magister himself waited in his great hall, a massive man whose silk robes couldn't quite hide the calculating intelligence in his eyes. Lord Snow, Illyrio said, rising from his chair with surprising grace for a man of his size. Welcome to my humble home. I trust your journey was pleasant. Pleasant enough, Jon replied, studying his host with the wariness of a wolf scenting danger. Though I suspect you didn't invite me here to discuss the weather. Illyrio's laugh was rich and genuine. Direct. I appreciate that in a young man. Yes. I confess I have ulterior motives. Your reputation precedes you, my lord. The Wolf of Fire, they call you in the markets. The bastard who tamed dragons and freed slaves. I prefer Jon Snow, Jon said simply. Of course, but names have power, don't they? And yours has been growing stronger with each passing day. Illyrio gestured toward a side chamber where servants waited with wine and delicacies. Come, let us dine. There are others I would have you meet. The feast that followed was a careful dance of diplomacy and veiled threats. Ilyu had assembled an eclectic group of guests, merchants and sellsword captains, exiled nobles and ambitious magisters. All of them studied Jon with the intensity of predators evaluating potential prey or competition. But it was the pair seated at Illyri's right hand that drew Jon's attention. A young man with silver gold hair and violet eyes sat beside a girl who couldn't have been more than 15. Both bore the unmistakable features of old Valyria, though the boy's face was twisted with arrogance while the girl's showed only quiet resignation. "Allow me to present my honored guests," Illyrio said during a lull in the conversation. "Prince Viserys Targaryen, rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms, and his sister Princess Daenerys." The silence that followed was deafening. Jon felt every eye in the room turn toward him, waiting to see how he would react to meeting the last scions of the dynasty his dragon's ancestors had once served. "Your Grace," Jon said finally, inclining his head in a gesture that acknowledged rank without showing submission. "Princess." Viserys' response was immediate and venomous. "So you're the beggar wolf with stolen pets. I wondered when we would meet." The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Jon felt Balinian tense on his shoulder, the dragon's scales beginning to smoke with suppressed flame. Around the table, hands moved subtly toward weapons as the tension ratcheted higher. "Stolen?" Jon's voice was soft, but it carried the promise of winter winds. "I think you're mistaken, Your Grace. These dragons chose me, just as they once chose your ancestors." "Impossible," Viserys snarled, rising from his chair. "Dragons serve the blood of the dragon, not northern bastards with delusions of grandeur." Jon stood as well, his gray eyes meeting Viserys' violet ones without flinching. For a moment the great hall held its breath, waiting to see if words would give way to steel. "Brother, please," Daenerys said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We are guests here." The simple words broke the tension like a stone thrown into still water. Viserys sat back down with obvious reluctance, while Jon remained standing for a moment longer before resuming his seat. "Wise words, Princess," Illyrio said smoothly, signaling for servants to refill the wine cups. "Now shall we discuss more pleasant matters?" The rest of the feast passed without incident, though Jon could feel Viserys' hatred like a physical weight. The prince made several more attempts to provoke him, each more desperate than the last. But Jon had learned the value of patience. Let the boy rage, it only made him look weak in front of potential allies. But it was Daenerys who truly captured his attention. She spoke little during the meal, but when she did, her words showed an intelligence that belied her youth. More importantly, Jon noticed how her eyes followed his dragons, tracking their movements with a hunger that reminded him of his own dreams. After the feast, Jon found himself walking in Illyrio's gardens, seeking solitude among the exotic flowers and fountains. The evening air was warm and fragrant, a welcome change from the tension of the great hall. "They're beautiful," a soft voice said behind him. Jon turned to find Daenerys approaching, her silver hair catching the moonlight like spun silk. She moved with the unconscious grace of someone born to nobility, but her violet eyes held depths that spoke of pain and loss. "Your dragons," she clarified, stopping a few feet away. "I've never seen anything like them." "Neither had I, until they hatched," Jon replied, studying her face in the moonlight. Up close, she was even younger than he had thought, barely 15, with the kind of ethereal beauty that had made Targaryen women legendary. "How?" she asked simply. Jon was quiet for a moment, considering how much to reveal. "Fire and blood," he said finally. "The old words of your house, they mean more than most people realize." Daenerys nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the dragons perched on his shoulders. "My brother says they should serve him, that dragons know the blood of old Valyria. What do you think?" The question seemed to surprise her. I don't know. I've never been asked what I think about anything." Jon studied her face, noting the way she held herself, poised but fragile, like a flower that had learned to bend rather than break. "You have Targaryen blood. You should be able to feel them, at least a little." "Feel them?" "Their emotions, their thoughts. It's like..." Jon paused, searching for the right words. Like hearing a song in a language you don't quite understand, but the melody makes sense anyway. Daenerys was quiet for a long moment, her eyes closed as if listening for something only she could hear. When she opened them again, there was wonder in her expression. "I can feel them," she whispered. "They're curious about me and protective of you." "Dragons choose their own riders," Jon said quietly. "Blood helps, but it's not everything. They respond to strength, to will, to the fire that burns inside." "I don't have fire inside me," Daenerys said sadly. "I'm just empty." Jon studied her face, seeing past the resignation to the steel beneath. "You're wrong. I can see it in your eyes, the same hunger I feel in my dreams. You're not empty, princess. You're waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For the moment when you stop being what others want you to be and start being who you were meant to be." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Viserys emerged from the shadows, his face twisted with rage and wine. "Sister," he snarled, grabbing Daenerys by the arm hard enough to make her wince. "What are you doing out here with this pretender?" "We were just talking," Daenerys said quietly, but Jon could see the fear in her eyes. Talking, Viserys' grip tightened, and Jon felt his dragon stir restlessly on his shoulders. "About what?" "About how he stole what rightfully belongs to us." "I stole nothing," Jon said, his voice carrying the promise of winter storms. "And you're hurting her. She's my sister. I'll do what I please with her." Viserys' voice rose to a near shout. "Just as those dragons should serve me, not some northern bastard who—" The words died in his throat as Balerion launched himself from Jon's shoulder, landing on Viserys' chest with claws extended. The dragon was still small, but his talons were sharp enough to pierce silk and draw blood. More importantly, the flames that danced around his maw made it clear that size wasn't everything. "Let her go." Jon's voice was soft, but it carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Viserys released Daenerys immediately, his face pale with terror. "Call it off," he whispered. "Call off your beast." "He's not my beast," Jon replied calmly. "He's my partner, and he doesn't like bullies." But the Orien held his position for another moment, before returning to Jon's shoulder with obvious reluctance. The message had been delivered clearly enough. Touch the girl again, and face the consequences. "This isn't over," Viserys snarled, backing away toward the manse. "Dragons serve the blood of the dragon, not northern bastards. You'll see." As the prince disappeared into the shadows, Jon turned to Daenerys. She was rubbing her arm where her brother had grabbed her, and he could see the finger-shaped bruises already forming. "Are you all right?" he asked, gently. "I'm used to it," she replied, but there was something new in her voice, a spark that hadn't been there before. "You shouldn't have to be." Daenerys looked up at him, her violet eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Why did you help me? You don't know me." "I know enough," Jon said simply. "I know what it's like to be treated as less than you are because of circumstances beyond your control." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Two young people who had learned hard lessons about the nature of power and the price of survival. "I should go," Daenerys said finally. "Viserys will be angry enough as it is." "Princess," Jon called as she turned to leave, "remember what I said about waiting. Your moment will come." She paused at the garden's edge, looking back over her shoulder. "A wolf with dragons," she murmured. So quietly he almost didn't hear. "What are you?" Jon had no answer for that question. He wasn't sure he knew himself anymore. The next morning brought Jon's departure from Pentos, but not before one final meeting with his host. Illyrio received him in his private study. A room lined with books and maps that spoke of a mind that saw the world as a vast game board. "I trust your stay was enlightening?" the Magister asked, settling his bulk into a chair that creaked under his weight. "Educational," Jon replied carefully. "Though I suspect you had more in mind than simple hospitality." Illyrio's laugh was rich and knowing. Direct as always. "Very well, I'll speak plainly. You're building something in Essos, young lord. Something that could reshape the balance of power from here to Slaver's Bay. Such endeavors require resources, allies, connections, and you're offering to provide them? For the right price, naturally. I am, after all, a merchant." Jon studied the fat man's face, reading the calculations behind his jovial expression. "What price?" "Nothing you couldn't afford. A small favor here, a bit of information there. Perhaps the occasional use of your unique assets for matters of mutual interest. You want to buy me, Jon said bluntly. I want to invest in you, Illyrio corrected. There's a difference. Jon was quiet for a moment, considering the offer. Illyrio's resources would be invaluable in the struggles to come, but the price would be his independence, the freedom to choose his own path without regard for the schemes of others. I'll consider your offer, he said finally. But understand this, I serve no master but my own conscience. If our interests align, we can work together. If they don't, then we become enemies, Illyrio finished, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I understand perfectly. You're very much like your father in that regard. The comment sent a chill down Jon's spine. You knew my father? I know many things, young lord, including some truths that might surprise you. Illyrio's smile widened, but those are conversations for another day. As Jon prepared to leave, he found Daenerys waiting by the docks. She stood alone, her silver hair whipping in the sea breeze, and for a moment she looked less like a princess than a lost child. You're leaving, she said as he approached. I have responsibilities, Jon replied. People depending on me. Of course. Her voice was wistful, but there was something else there. A strength that hadn't been present the night before. Will I see you again? I think so, Jon said, though he wasn't sure why he was so certain. The world is smaller than it seems, especially for people like us. People like us, people who were born to be more than what others expect. Daenerys smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness he had seen from her. I'll remember that. As Jon's ship pulled away from the dock, he watched the city of Pentos shrink behind him. But his thoughts weren't on the Magister's schemes or the challenges waiting in Saltshore. Instead, he found himself thinking about violet eyes and silver hair, about a girl who had been taught to see herself as a pawn, but who carried the potential to become a queen. Dangerous waters, lad, Thoros said, joining him at the rail. Targaryens are fire as much as you are. Mix fire with fire, and you get either a great blaze or a great explosion. Which do you think it will be? Jon asked. The Red Priest was quiet for a long moment, studying his former squire's face. I think it will be whatever you choose it to be. That's what makes you so dangerous, and so necessary. As Pentos disappeared over the horizon, Jon felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a cloak. Somewhere behind them, a dragon princess was learning to see herself as more than a pawn. Somewhere ahead, the Golden Company waited with steel and fire. And somewhere in between, the future of two continents hung in the balance. Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell and last of the Dragon Lords, sailed toward that future with eyes as gray as winter storms and dragons on his shoulders. Whatever came next, he would meet it on his own terms. The world would have to be enough. In Winterfell, Arya Stark crept through the corridors of Winterfell. The castle was quiet at this hour, with most of its inhabitants long since abed. But she had never been one to keep normal hours. She found her father in his solar bent over a collection of letters and maps. The candlelight cast deep shadows across his face, making him look older than his years. Father, she said softly, not wanting to startle him. Ned looked up, his gray eyes reflecting the same weariness she had been seeing more often lately. Arya, you should be sleeping. So should you, she replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. You've been staying up late from the time news from Essos started to arrive. Is everything all right for Jon out there? Can we help him somehow? Ned was quiet for a moment, studying his youngest daughter's face. At 9, Arya already showed signs of the wolf blood that ran strong in the Stark line. But there was something else there too, an intelligence that reminded him painfully of Jon. I've been thinking about your brother, he admitted. Jon? Arya's face lit up with interest. What about him? The reports say he's in danger. Many mercenary companions have been hired for his head. But there's no way we can help him there. If it was Westeros, I'd have prevented all this from happening in first place. If we try to help him, our enemies here will seize this opportunity to use against us. Ned studied his daughter's face, seeing echoes of the boy who had left Winterfell with Thoros of Myr. Do you think he's still our Jon? I think he's more Jon than he's ever been, Arya replied without hesitation. Just bigger, stronger, more like what he was always meant to be. The simple faith in her voice made Ned's chest tighten with emotion. I hope you're right, little one. I hope you're right. The blade came from the shadows like a whisper of death, its steel gleaming in the torchlight of Saltshore's harbor. Jon Snow had only a heartbeat to react, his hand moving to his sword hilt as instinct screamed danger. But the assassin was skilled, trained in the killing arts of Braavos, and his strike would have found its mark if not for the small dragon perched on Jon's shoulder. Ygritte, named for the wildling girl who had captured his heart in dreams, launched herself from her roost with a shriek of rage. Her claws raked across the assassin's face, drawing blood and spoiling his aim. The poisoned dagger meant for Jon's heart instead carved a line of fire across his ribs, parting leather and flesh with equal ease. Jon's sword cleared its sheath in a single fluid motion, but the assassin was already moving, dancing back into the maze of crates and barrels that lined the docks. A second killer emerged from behind a stack of grain sacks, crossbow raised and aimed at Jon's chest. Down! Mira Blackwater's voice cut through the night as she tackled Jon to the wooden planks. The crossbow bolt whistled overhead, embedding itself in the mast of a nearby fishing boat with a solid thunk. What followed was chaos. Ser Gareth's sword sang as it cleared leather, the knight moving with the deadly grace of a man who had survived too many battles to count. Thoros of Myr appeared from nowhere, his flaming sword casting dancing shadows as he engaged a third assassin who had been creeping toward Jon's fallen form. But it was the dragons that turned the tide. But Berion and Ygritte, sensing their master's pain and rage, unleashed their fury upon the attackers. They were still small, but their flames were real enough. The assassin with the crossbow screamed as dragon fire caught his cloak, sending him stumbling backward into the harbor with a splash. The fight was over in minutes, leaving 3 dead killers and 1 wounded dragonlord bleeding onto the salt-stained planks of Saltshore's docks. How bad? Jon asked through gritted teeth, pressing a hand to his wounded side. Blood seeped between his fingers, warm and sticky in the cool night air. Bad enough, Thoros replied, kneeling beside him with the practiced efficiency of a man who had tended many battlefield wounds. The blade was poisoned, something from the east, by the smell of it. We need to get you to the keep. As willing hands lifted him onto a stretcher, Jon caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. One of the dead assassins wore a ring bearing the seal of a Volnov noble house, the tiger and flame of House Kuros, one of the old blood families that had ruled the Black Walls for centuries. Volantis, he whispered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. We'll deal with them later, Mira said firmly, walking beside the stretcher as they made their way through Saltshore's winding streets. Right now, we focus on keeping you alive. In King's Landing, Lord Petyr Baelish sat in his solar. He studied the latest reports from his network of informants. The brothel keeper turned master of coin had been tracking developments in Essos with the keen interest of a man who understood that chaos was a ladder and that ladders could be climbed in both directions. Fascinating, he murmured to himself, reading an account of the assassination attempt that had nearly claimed Jon Snow's life. The boy survives his first real test of power. The question is what he learns from it. Littlefinger had built his own rise on the careful manipulation of information and the strategic elimination of rivals. He recognized in the young Dragonlord a kindred spirit, someone who understood that true power came not from the sword alone, but from knowing where to strike and when. The bastard of Winterfell grows more interesting by the day, he said to the empty room. The fever came with the dawn, burning through Jon's body like wildfire, as the poison fought against his natural resilience. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his dreams filled with images of ice and fire, of dragons soaring over frozen battlefields and wolves running beneath burning skies. Thoros worked tirelessly at his bedside, using every trick of healing he had learned in his years of service to the Lord of Light. The Red Priest's hands glowed with inner fire as he drew the poison from Jon's wound, his prayers mixing with the smell of burning flesh and medicinal herbs. Every leader bleeds for their cause, Thoros murmured as he worked, his voice hoarse from hours of prayer. The question is whether they learn from the bleeding or let it break them. Jon's council gathered in the chamber outside his sick room, their voices raised in heated debate about how to respond to the attack. Through the haze of fever, he could hear fragments of their arguments, calls for immediate retaliation, demands for caution, the clash of different philosophies about the nature of power and justice. We should burn their estates, Ser Gareth declared, his voice carrying the cold fury of a man who had nearly lost someone he had sworn to protect. Send a message that attacking our Lord carries a price, and kill how many innocents in the process. Mira countered, her tone sharp with moral outrage. We're supposed to be better than the slavers and tyrants we fight against. Better doesn't keep us alive, came another voice. Captain Blackwater of the Burned Men, whose company had joined Jon's cause after the meeting with the mercenary captains. The Volantins tried to murder our lord. They need to learn the cost of such actions. The debate raged for hours, with no clear resolution emerging. Some called for immediate military action, others for diplomatic protests, still others for covert retaliation that would send a message without triggering open war. But all of them were missing the larger point, the lesson that Jon was learning, even as the poison burned through his veins. Politics was blood and shadows. Power was not just about inspiring loyalty or commanding dragons. It was about knowing your enemies before they struck, about having eyes and ears in every corner of the world, about being 3 steps ahead of those who would destroy you. As the fever finally broke on the 3rd day, Jon's first coherent words were not about revenge or retaliation, but about information. I need to know, he whispered to Thoros, his voice barely audible in the quiet chamber. Everything. Who hired them? How they found me? Who else might be coming? I need to know it all. The Red Priest studied his former squire's face, noting the new hardness in his gray eyes. Knowledge is power, lad. But it's also a burden. Are you sure you're ready to carry it? I'm sure I can't afford not to, Jon replied, struggling to sit up, despite the pain in his side. I was blind, and it nearly got me killed. I won't make that mistake again. In Winterfell, Sansa Stark sat in the godswood, her embroidery forgotten in her lap as she stared up at the heart tree's carved face. The weirwood's red eyes seemed to watch her with ancient wisdom, and she found herself wondering what the old gods thought of her bastard brother's transformation. The latest letter from across the narrow sea had arrived that morning, bearing news of the assassination attempt and Jon's narrow escape from death. Sansa had read it 3 times, each reading filling her with a mixture of fear and pride that she couldn't quite understand. He's becoming something else, she whispered to the watching tree. Something harder than the boy who left us. Footsteps on the path behind her announced her father's approach. Ned Stark looked older than his years, the weight of lordship and the constant worry about his bastard son taking their toll on his weathered features. Ned was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes reflecting the same mix of emotions that churned in his daughter's heart. The reports suggested, yes, your brother has changed since leaving Winterfell. Changed how? He's learned to be hard when hardness is needed, to make the choices that others can't or won't make. Ned's voice carried a note of sadness that made Sansa's chest tighten. It's what the world demanded of him, but I sometimes wonder if we've lost the boy we knew in the process. Sansa considered this, thinking of the Jon she remembered, quiet, serious, always watching and thinking, maybe we haven't lost him, maybe he's just more himself than he ever could be here. The simple wisdom in her words made Ned smile, despite his worries. When did you become so wise, little one? When I started paying attention to the world beyond Winterfell's walls, Sansa replied. Jon always understood that he'd have to make his own way. Maybe that's why he's so good at it now. The intelligence network that Jon began building in the days following his recovery was unlike anything seen in the Free Cities since the fall of Valyria. Taking inspiration from the whispered legends of Varys the Spider, he reached out to the forgotten and the overlooked, the beggars who saw everything, the sailors who carried gossip between ports, the freed slaves who remembered every slight and every kindness. Information is the sharpest blade, he told Mira as they worked to establish the network structure. A sword can kill one man, but the right piece of information can topple kingdoms. The work was painstaking and dangerous. Each contact had to be carefully vetted, each piece of intelligence cross-referenced against other sources. Jon learned to read between the lines of merchant reports, to see the patterns hidden in shipping manifests and tax records, to understand that the most valuable secrets were often hidden in plain sight. Within a fortnight, his web of informants stretched from Pentos to Volantis, from the docks of Tyros to the slave markets of Myr. Beggars reported on the movements of nobles, sailors carried coded messages between ports, and freed slaves kept watch on their former masters with the dedication of those who had tasted freedom and would die before losing it again. The first major success came when a former slave named Coro brought word of a second assassination plot. This one involving a poisoned wine shipment meant for Jon's table. The bottles were intercepted and destroyed, their contents proving lethal enough to kill a dozen men. "How did you know?" Jon asked the thin, scarred man who had once served in the kitchens of a Myrish magister. "The wine merchant." "He was too nervous," Coro replied, in broken common tongue. "Kept looking over shoulder. Sweating too much for cool day. And the coins he paid with. Too new, too clean. Fresh from Volantis mint." Jon nodded, filing away the lesson. It wasn't enough to watch for obvious threats. True danger often came disguised as routine business, hidden behind familiar faces and everyday transactions. In Volantis, Triarch Malakoa Mayor stood on the terrace of his palace, gazing out over the black walls that had protected the old blood for millennia. The Tiger Lord was a man of middle years, his face bearing the aquiline features of pure Valyrian descent, and his violet eyes burned with the fury of someone who had seen his carefully laid plans crumble to ash. "The bastard lives," his spy master reported, bowing low as he delivered the unwelcome news. "The assassins are dead, and our connection to House Quarters has been discovered." "Incompetence," Malakos snarled, his hands gripping the marble balustrade hard enough to make his knuckles white. "How does a northern bastard defeat killers trained in the finest schools of Braavos?" "The dragons, my lord. They fought like demons to protect their master, and his companions were more skilled than we anticipated." Malako was quiet for a long moment, his mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. The young Dragon Lord's growing influence threatened everything the old blood had built. Their monopoly on power, their control of the slave trade, their very way of life. He could not be allowed to continue his crusade of liberation. Double the price on his head, he decided. And this time hire the faceless men. If gold cannot buy his death, perhaps the gods of Braavos can. "My lord, the faceless men charge." "I know what they charge," Malako cut him off. "Pay it. The bastard's death is worth any price." The war council that convened a week after Jon's recovery was a different affair from the heated debates that had followed the assassination attempt. The young Dragon Lord sat at the head of the table, his wounds still tender, but his mind sharp as winter steel. Around him, his advisors waited with the patience of those who had learned to trust their leader's judgment. "The intelligence is clear," Jon began, spreading a collection of reports across the oak table. "House Kauros was acting on behalf of Triarch Malako, Megir. The assassination attempt was just the beginning. They're planning something larger." "How much larger?" Septon Gareth asked, studying the documents with a soldier's eye for detail. "Large enough to require the services of the Faceless Men," Jon replied, watching as faces around the table paled at the mention of the legendary assassins. "Apparently, my continued existence is worth a considerable investment." "The Faceless Men have never failed," Thoros said quietly. "If they've taken the contract, then we'd better make sure they don't get the chance to fulfill it," Jon finished. "Which brings us to the question of how we respond." The debate that followed was more focused than the earlier arguments, shaped by the hard realities of their situation. They couldn't ignore the threat. The Faceless Men would keep coming until either Jon was dead or their employer was eliminated. But neither could they afford to be reckless in their response. "We could hire our own assassins," Captain Blackwater suggested. "Fight shadow with shadow, and become the very thing we claim to oppose." Mira's voice carried the moral certainty that had made her Jon's conscience in darker moments. "There has to be another way." "There is," Jon said quietly, his gray eyes reflecting the candlelight like chips of winter ice. "We don't hire assassins. We become them." The silence that followed was deafening. Around the table, faces showed mixtures of shock, understanding, and grim acceptance, as the implications of Jon's words sank in. "You're talking about murder," Sarah Gareth said finally. "I'm talking about survival," Jon corrected. "Mulekor Myr has declared war on everything we've built here. He's hired killers to murder me in my sleep, poisoners to taint my food, and now the Faceless Men to finish what the others couldn't. How many of our people have to die before we acknowledge that this is already a war?" "But if we sink to their level," Mira began. "We don't sink to their level," Jon interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made peace with hard choices. "We do what's necessary to protect the innocent people who depend on us. Malako has made himself our enemy through his actions. The only question is whether we wait for him to succeed in killing us, or whether we act first." The vote, when it came, was not unanimous. Mira abstained, unable to support what she saw as cold-blooded murder, but unwilling to abandon Jon when he needed her most. Thoros voted in favor with obvious reluctance, his faith in the Lord of Light warring with his affection for his former squire. But the majority was clear. Triarch Malakoko Megar had signed his own death warrant the moment he hired assassins to kill their lord. In King's Landing, Cersei Lannister stood before the painted table in the small council chamber, studying the carved map of Westeros, with the calculating gaze of someone who understood that power was a zero-sum game. The Queen Regent had been following developments in Essos with growing concern, recognizing in Jon Snow a potential threat to everything she had worked to achieve. A bastard with dragons, she mused to her brother Jaime, who stood beside her with his usual air of casual indifference. How very inconvenient. He's half a world away, Jaime replied, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe his own words. What threat could he possibly pose to us? The same threat that Aegon the Conqueror posed to the Seven Kingdoms 3 centuries ago, Cersei said sharply. Dragons don't recognize borders, brother, and bastards with nothing to lose are the most dangerous enemies of all. She turned from the map to face him, her green eyes burning with the intensity that had made her both feared and desired throughout the realm. We need to keep watching him, and if he ever turns his attention westward, we'll deal with that when it happens, Jaime said, but his hand moved unconsciously to his sword hilt. Cersei smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. Oh, we'll deal with it long before that, dear brother. The key to handling dragons is to kill them while they're still small enough to kill. The assassination of Triarch Malako Masidar was a masterpiece of planning and execution that would have impressed even Varys the Spider. Jon's network of informants provided detailed intelligence on the Triarch's movements, his habits, his security arrangements. A freed slave who had once served in his kitchens provided the layout of his palace. A sailor who regularly delivered wine to his table carried the poison that would end his life. The death itself was almost anticlimactic. Malako collapsed during a feast celebrating the anniversary of his election to the Triarchy, his violet eyes wide with shock as the poison raced through his veins. By the time his guards realized what was happening, it was too late. The most powerful man in Volantis was dead, and his killer was already lost in the crowd of servants and slaves who had learned to be invisible. The message that accompanied news of his death was simple and unsigned. The wolf remembers his enemies. Within days, the contract on Jon's life was quietly withdrawn. The faceless men, pragmatic as always, saw no profit in pursuing a target whose employer could no longer pay. The other members of the Triarchy, shocked by the sudden death of their colleague, began to reconsider their own positions on the young Dragon Lord, who had proven himself capable of reaching across continents to settle accounts. But it was the reaction of Jon's own people that proved most telling. The sellswords and freed slaves who made up his following didn't recoil from their leader's actions. They embraced them. Here was a man who would kill to protect them, who would reach into the heart of enemy territory to eliminate threats before they could strike. Here was a leader worthy of their loyalty. You've crossed a line, Thoros told Jon, as they stood on the battlements of Saltshore's Keep, watching the sun set over waters that had run red with the blood of their enemies. I've learned a lesson, Jon corrected, his gray eyes reflecting the dying light. Politics is blood and shadows. Power isn't just about inspiring loyalty or commanding dragons. It's about knowing your enemies and eliminating them before they can destroy what you've built. And if that makes you no better than the tyrants you fight against? Jon was quiet for a long moment, considering the question that had haunted him since giving the order for Malako's death. Then I'll be a tyrant who protects the innocent instead of one who preys on them. Sometimes that's the best choice available. The Red Priest studied his former squire's face, noting the new hardness in his features. The boy who had left Winterfell with dreams of honor and justice was gone, replaced by a man who understood that good intentions meant nothing without the will to enforce them. I pray you remember that distinction, Thoros said finally. I pray I never have to forget it, Jon replied. In Winterfell, Arya Stark crept through the corridors of the castle, her bare feet making no sound on the ancient stones. She had been practicing the silent movement, but tonight she had a different purpose. She wanted to hear what the adults were saying about Jon, when they thought no children were listening. She found her father and his solar, with Maester Luwin, their voices low and serious, as they discussed the latest reports from across the narrow sea. Arya pressed herself against the door, straining to catch every word. The boy has changed, Maester Luwin was saying. his voice carrying the concern of someone who had helped raise Jon from infancy. "These reports speak of actions that would have been unthinkable for the child we knew." "The world changed him," Ned replied, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Just as it changes all of us, given enough pressure. But assassination? Political murder? This is not the path of honor, my lord." "No," Ned agreed, "but it may be the path of survival, and sometimes survival is the most honorable choice available." Arya frowned, trying to understand the implications of what she was hearing. Jon had killed someone. Not in battle, but in secret, like the assassins in the stories old Nan used to tell. But he had done it to protect people, to keep them safe from enemies who would have destroyed everything he had built. "Is he still our Jon?" she whispered to herself, echoing the question that had haunted her family for months. The answer came to her with startling clarity. He was more Jon than he had ever been. The bastard boy who had always stood apart, who had always understood that he would have to make his own way in the world, had simply learned to do so more effectively than anyone had imagined possible. Arya smiled in the darkness, proud of her brother, despite the fear his actions inspired in others. Jon Snow had always been different. Now he was learning to make that difference count. The network that Jon built in the weeks following Maleko's death was more than just an intelligence operation. It was a web of loyalty that stretched across the free cities and beyond. Former slaves carried his messages, freed prisoners served as his eyes and ears, and sellswords who had found purpose in his cause became his instruments of justice. The second major test came when reports reached him of a slaving operation in the disputed lands, a fortress where captured children were trained as pleasure slaves for the brothels of Lights and Tyrosh. The intelligence was detailed and damning. Hundreds of children, some as young as 6, subjected to horrors that made even hardened sellswords sick with rage. "We could report it to the local authorities," Mira suggested during the council meeting that followed the report's arrival. "The local authorities are being paid to look the other way." Jon replied, his voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who had learned to see the world as it truly was. "If we want those children saved, we'll have to do it ourselves." "That's 3 days' march through hostile territory," Ser Gareth pointed out. "And the fortress is heavily defended. We'd be risking everything for children who have no one else to save them." Jon interrupted. "For innocents, who will die or worse if we do nothing." The debate that followed was brief, but intense. Some argued for caution, others for immediate action. But in the end, the decision was Jon's to make, and he made it with the same cold calculation that had marked all his choices since the assassination attempt. "We go," he decided, "not as conquerors but as liberators. We save the children, we eliminate the slavers, and we send a message that some lines cannot be crossed." The raid that followed was swift and brutal. Jon's forces struck at dawn, using intelligence provided by escaped slaves to bypass the fortress's outer defenses. The dragons, now large enough to carry messages and small weapons, served as aerial scouts and psychological weapons, their presence sowing panic among defenders who had never faced such creatures. The battle was over in less than an hour. The slavers who surrendered were given quick deaths, a mercy they had never shown their victims. Those who fought to the end found no mercy at all, cut down by sellswords who had learned to hate everything the slave trade represented. But it was the aftermath that truly showed how much Jon had changed. As his forces freed the children and tended to their wounds, he stood among the bodies of the dead slavers with an expression of cold satisfaction. "No prisoners?" Thoros asked, noting the absence of any surviving enemies. "No prisoners," Jon confirmed. "Some crimes are beyond forgiveness. Some people forfeit their right to live by their actions." The Red Priest studied his former squire's face, seeing in it the same hardness that had marked great leaders throughout history, the ability to make terrible choices and live with the consequences. "You're becoming something new," he observed. "I'm becoming what the world needs me to be," Jon replied. "Nothing more, nothing less." Standing on the deck of his flagship as they sailed back toward Salt Shore, Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell, last of the Dragon Lords, the Wolf of Fire, watched his dragons soar overhead, and felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a familiar cloak. The world had made him what he was. Now it was time to see what he could make of the world in return. The price of loyalty, he had learned, was paid in blood and shadows. But sometimes that price was worth paying. Sometimes it was the only price that mattered. The fortress of Gozai squatted on the hillside, like a festering wound, its black stone walls rising from the barren earth of the disputed lands. From his position on the ridge overlooking the slaver stronghold, Jon Snow studied the fortification through a borrowed spyglass, noting the guard rotations, the placement of ballistae, and the iron cages that lined the outer courtyard like a grotesque garden. 200 slaves, maybe more, Mira Blackwater reported quietly, lowering her own spyglass. Mostly children and young women. The bastards are preparing a shipment for Les. Jon's jaw tightened as he watched small figures moving behind the bars of the cages. Even at this distance, he could see the hopelessness in their postures, the way they huddled together for warmth and comfort that would never come. The sight kindled something cold and terrible in his chest, not the hot rage of youth, but the calculating fury of a man who had learned that some evils could only be answered with steel and fire. Guard strength, he asked Sarah Gareth, who had been studying the fortress's defenses with a soldier's eye. 60 men, maybe 70. Well-armed, but undisciplined. They're used to dealing with merchant caravans and escaped slaves. Not a real military force. The grizzled knight spat into the dust. They won't expect a night attack. They won't expect dragons either, Jon murmured, feeling Balerion shift restlessly on his shoulder. The black dragon had grown considerably in recent weeks, with scales that gleamed like polished obsidian and eyes that burned with inner fire. His sister Ygritte perched on Jon's other shoulder, her red and gold scales catching the afternoon sunlight. Behind them, the army that Jon had assembled over the past months waited in disciplined silence. 500 sellswords, freed slaves, and volunteers from a dozen different cities and backgrounds, united by a common cause and an uncommon leader. They had marched inland from Saltshore 3 days ago, following reports of increased slaving activity in the disputed lands. But unity of purpose didn't mean unity of vision. As Jon had learned during the heated council sessions that had preceded their departure. "This is madness," Captain Torrhen Blackwater had argued, his scarred face twisted with frustration. "We're a trading company, not a crusading army. Every day we spend chasing slavers is a day we're not earning coin. Coin earned from the suffering of innocents is blood money," Mira had countered, her dark eyes flashing with moral certainty. "We have the power to free these people. How can we do anything else?" "Power without profit is just expensive charity," Torrhen shot back, "and charity doesn't pay for weapons, food, or the wages of our men." The debate had raged for hours, with Jon listening to all sides while his dragons perched nearby, their presence a constant reminder of the power that ultimately made all decisions his to make. In the end, he had found a solution that satisfied no one completely but gave everyone something they could accept. "We take the fortress," he had decided. "We free the slaves and offer them the same choice we've offered others. Freedom to go where they will, or a place in our ranks. Any treasure we find goes to fund our operations." And Captain Blackwater, he had fixed the sellsword with a stare that promised consequences. "If coin is your only concern, remember that grateful freed slaves make excellent sources of information about other slaving operations. Information that can be quite profitable to those who know how to use it." Now, as they prepared for the assault, Jon could see the wisdom of that compromise reflected in the faces of his followers. The sellswords were motivated by the promise of loot and future profits. The freed slaves burned with the desire to strike back at their former oppressors. The idealists like Mira fought for justice and liberation, and all of them followed him because he had proven himself capable of balancing their competing needs while never losing sight of the larger goal. "The plan is simple," Jon told his assembled captains as the sun began to set behind the western hills. "We strike at midnight, when the guards are tired and the slaves are locked away for the night. 3 groups. Sarah Gareth takes the main gate, Captain Blackwater hits the armory, and I lead the assault on the slave quarters. The dragons provide reconnaissance and create chaos among the defenders." "What about prisoners?" The question came from Sarah Marcus Faith, a Dornish knight who had joined their cause after witnessing Jon's dragons firsthand. "Officers and anyone who surrenders immediately will be spared for questioning," Jon replied, his voice carrying the cold authority that had grown stronger with each difficult decision. "Anyone who fights to the end or tries to harm the slaves dies, no exceptions." The assault began at the stroke of midnight, with Jon's forces moving through the darkness like wolves hunting prey. The dragons proved their worth immediately. their keen eyes guiding the attackers around hidden sentries and their small but deadly flames creating panic among the fortress's defenders. Jon led the charge on the slave quarters, his sword singing as it cut through the night air. The guards there were caught completely off guard, some still struggling into their armor as steel-clad figures emerged from the shadows. The fight was brief and brutal, with no quarter asked or given. "The keys!" Jon shouted to Meera as she dispatched the last guard with clinical efficiency. "Find the keys." The sound of cage doors opening was like music to Jon's ears, followed by the whispered prayers and sobs of people who had given up hope of ever seeing freedom again. Children stumbled out of their prisons on shaking legs, while women clutched each other for support and comfort. But it was the sight of Jon himself that truly broke their despair. Standing in the courtyard with dragons on his shoulders and blood on his blade, he looked like something out of legend, a figure of myth and power, who had come to break their chains and offer them a choice. "You are free," he told them in the mixture of common tongue and High Valyrian, that had become his standard address to liberated slaves. "Free to go where you will, to seek whatever life you choose. But if you wish it, there is also a place for you among my followers. We offer food, shelter, training, and the chance to ensure that what happened to you never happens to others." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Of the 237 slaves freed from Gozai, nearly 200 chose to join Jon's growing army. They were weak from captivity and traumatized by their experiences, but they burned with the fierce determination of people who had been given a second chance at life. In King's Landing, Lord Varys glided through the corridors of the Red Keep like a silk-clad specter, his soft shoes making no sound on the ancient stones. In his chambers, surrounded by the tools of his trade, coded letters, detailed maps, and reports from his network of little birds, the spider contemplated the growing legend of Jon Snow with the calculating mind that had kept him alive through the reigns of 3 kings. Studying the latest intelligence from Essos, the bastard of Winterfell becomes a liberator of slaves, a commander of dragons, a figure of myth and power. The realm watches from across the narrow sea and wonders what it means. "Power is a curious thing," Varys whispered to the shadows. "It flows like water, seeking its own level, creating its own channels. And this young wolf has become quite the channel indeed." He reached for parchment and quill, his mind already composing the carefully worded reports that would find their way to certain interested parties throughout the 7 kingdoms. The Game of Thrones had enough players already, but it seemed another piece was being added to the board, one that could change the entire nature of the game. The celebration that followed the liberation of Gozai was unlike anything Jon had experienced since leaving Winterfell. His followers, sellswords and freed slaves, idealists and pragmatists, came together in a display of unity that transcended their different backgrounds and motivations. Around the campfires that dotted the hillside, stories were shared in a dozen different languages. Former slaves spoke of their gratitude and their determination to prevent others from suffering as they had. Sellswords boasted of their prowess in battle and the loot they had claimed from the fortress. Idealists like Meera spoke of justice and liberation, while pragmatists like Captain Blackwater calculated the strategic value of their victory. But it was Thoros of Myr who captured the moment's true significance. The Red Priest stood at the edge of the celebration, watching Jon move among his followers with the easy authority of a born leader. The young man who had once been his squire now commanded the loyalty of hundreds, his presence inspiring confidence and devotion in equal measure. "The boy is gone," Thoros whispered to himself, his words barely audible over the sounds of celebration. "A king walks here." The observation was more prophetic than the priest realized. As Jon moved through the camp, accepting congratulations and listening to the concerns of his followers, he could feel something changing within himself. The dreams that had once been vague and formless were becoming clearer, more focused. He saw himself not just as a liberator of slaves or a commander of sellswords, but as something greater, a force for change in a world that desperately needed it. The dragons seemed to sense this transformation as well. Baeledian and Ygritte had grown more responsive to his thoughts and emotions, their bond with him deepening with each passing day. During the battle at Gozai, they had fought with a coordination and purpose that went beyond mere training. They had become extensions of his will, instruments of his power. "My lord," Sir Gareth approached, his weathered face showing the satisfaction of a soldier who had seen a plan executed flawlessly. The fortress is secure, and we found something you should see. John followed the knight to what had once been the slaver captain's quarters, now stripped of its luxurious furnishings and converted into a makeshift command post. On the oak table that dominated the room, maps and documents were spread out like pieces of a vast puzzle. Intelligence, Ser Gareth explained, gesturing to the papers. Trade routes, shipping schedules, contacts in a dozen different cities. This fortress wasn't just a holding pen, it was a hub for slaving operations throughout the disputed lands. John studied the documents with growing interest, his mind already processing the implications. Each map showed potential targets, each schedule revealed opportunities for interdiction, each list of contacts provided intelligence that could be used to disrupt the entire network. How many more? He asked quietly. At least a dozen major operations, Mira replied, having joined them during the briefing. Maybe more. The entire region is infested with slavers and their supporters. Then we'll clean it out, John decided, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had found his purpose. All of it, every fortress, every caravan, every ship that carries human cargo. We'll break their network piece by piece until there's nothing left. That's a war, Captain Blackwater pointed out, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely opposed to the idea. A real war, not just raids and skirmishes. Then we'll fight a war, John replied simply. We have the men, the intelligence, and the motivation. More importantly, we have the right. The planning session that followed lasted until dawn, with John and his advisors working out the details of a campaign that would reshape the balance of power in the disputed lands. It was ambitious, dangerous, and likely to make enemies of some of the most powerful people in Essos. But it was also necessary, and John had learned that necessity often trumped caution in the game of power. In Pentos, Magister Iliao Mopatis sat in his private study, surrounded by the luxurious trappings of wealth and power. Before him lay a collection of reports from his network of spies and informants, each one adding another piece to the puzzle of Jon Snow's growing influence. Studying an account of the raid on Gozai, the boy learns quickly, perhaps too quickly for his own good. The fat Magister had been watching Jon's development with the keen interest of someone who understood that chaos could be profitable for those clever enough to exploit it. The young Dragonlord's crusade against slavery was disrupting established trade routes and creating opportunities for new arrangements that could be very lucrative for the right partners. But there was also danger in Jon's growing power. A man with dragons and an army of devoted followers was a wild card in the great game, capable of upsetting carefully laid plans and destroying profitable relationships. Illyrio would need to decide soon whether Jon Snow was an asset to be cultivated or a threat to be eliminated. Time will tell, he said to the empty room. Time will tell. The transformation of Jon's followers in the days following Gozai was remarkable to witness. The freed slaves, initially weak and traumatized, began to show signs of the strength that had kept them alive through their ordeal. Under the patient instruction of Mira and the other veterans, they learned to hold weapons, to march in formation, to think of themselves as soldiers rather than victims. But it was their devotion to Jon that truly set them apart. They looked at him not just as a commander or liberator, but as something approaching a religious figure. The man who had broken their chains and offered them a chance at redemption. When he walked among them, they reached out to touch his cloak, or whisper prayers in languages he didn't recognize. They worship you, Thoros observed one evening, as they watched the newest recruits practice their sword work. Not as a man, but as something more. That's dangerous, lad. Divine authority is a heady wine, and it's easy to become drunk on it. I don't want their worship, Jon replied, though he couldn't deny the intoxicating feeling that came with such absolute devotion. I want their loyalty, their dedication to the cause. The rest is just noise. Is it? The Red Priest studied his former squire's face in the firelight. Or is it the beginning of something that could consume you if you're not careful? Jon was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. The dreams that came to him now were filled with images of power and glory. Thrones of iron and gold, armies marching beneath dragon banners, cities bowing before his might. They were seductive visions, offering everything a bastard could never hope to achieve through birth or conventional means. I won't become what I fight against, he said finally. I won't become a tyrant. The best tyrants never set out to become tyrants, Thoros replied gently. They start as liberators, as champions of the oppressed. It's only later, when the cheers of the crowd become more important than the cause they once served, that they lose their way. The warning was well taken, but Jon couldn't shake the feeling that his path was already set. The dragons on his shoulders, the army at his back, the growing legend of the Wolf of Fire, all of it pointed toward a destiny that was larger than simple liberation or justice. In Tyrosh, the Archon of Tyros stood on the balcony of his palace, gazing out over the harbor, where merchant ships from across the known world loaded and unloaded their precious cargoes. Beside him, his spy master delivered the latest intelligence from the disputed lands, with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that bad news could be dangerous to the messenger. "The fortress of Gozai has fallen," the spy master reported. "Jon Snow's forces took it in a night assault. No survivors among the defenders, and all the slaves were freed." The Archon was quiet for a long moment, his mind processing the implications. Gozai had been a valuable partner in the slave trade, providing a steady stream of high-quality merchandise for Tyros's brothels and pleasure houses. Its destruction represented not just a financial loss, but a direct challenge to the established order. "How many men does he have now?" the Archon asked. "Nearly 800 by our count, and growing daily." The freed slaves flocked to his banner like moths to flame. "And the dragons? Still small, but growing. Our sources say they're becoming more dangerous with each passing week." The Archon nodded slowly, his decision crystallizing. "Send word to our allies in Reimagined and Myr. It's time to discuss a coordinated response to this Wolf of Fire, before he becomes too powerful to stop." The War Council that convened a week after Gozai's fall was different from any that had come before. Jon sat at the head of a table, surrounded not just by his original companions, but by representatives of the various groups that had joined his cause, former slaves who had proven themselves as leaders, sellsword captains who had brought their companies into his service, and even a few minor nobles who had been impressed by his growing legend. "The intelligence from Gozai has given us a complete picture of the slaving network in this region," Jon began, gesturing to the maps and documents that covered the table. 12 major fortresses, dozens of smaller operations, and a web of contacts that stretches from here to Slaver's Bay. "That's a lot of enemies," Captain Blackwater observed, though his tone suggested he relished the challenge. "More than we can handle with our current forces. Which is why we're not going to fight them all at once," Jon replied, his gray eyes reflecting the candlelight like chips of winter ice. "We're going to be smart about this. Hit them where they're weak, when they're unprepared, and always with overwhelming force." The strategy that emerged from the discussion was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to conquer territory or hold ground, Jon's forces would operate as a mobile army, striking at slaving operations throughout the region before disappearing back into the wilderness. Each successful raid would free more slaves, gather more intelligence, and add to their growing strength. "It's guerrilla warfare," Sarah Gareth noted, approvingly. "Hit and run, strike and fade. The dragons give us reconnaissance and psychological warfare, while our mobility keeps the enemy off balance." "Exactly," Jon confirmed. "We become the nightmare that haunts every slaver from here to the summer sea. They'll never know where we'll strike next, never feel safe in their fortresses, never be certain that their next shipment won't be intercepted." "And when they unite against us?" Mira asked, ever the voice of caution. "Then we'll be ready for them," Jon replied with a confidence that surprised even himself. "By then we'll have the numbers, the intelligence, and the reputation to face them on equal terms." As the council session concluded and his advisors dispersed to their various duties, Jon remained at the table, studying the maps by candlelight. The scope of what he was attempting was staggering, not just the liberation of individual slaves, but the complete dismantling of an economic system that had existed for centuries. But as he sat there, feeling the weight of his dragons on his shoulders and the loyalty of his followers like a tangible force, Jon found himself thinking not just of the immediate campaign, but of what might come after. The disputed lands were just the beginning. Beyond them lay the great cities of Essos, with their ancient walls and powerful magisters. Beyond those lay Slaver's Bay, where the trade in human flesh reached its most grotesque extremes. And beyond all of that, across the narrow sea, lay Westeros, the land of his birth, where bastards knew their place and dragons had been dead for 300 years. The dreams that came to him that night were clearer than ever before. He saw himself standing before the Iron Throne, dragons circling overhead as lords and ladies knelt in submission. He saw cities burning and armies marching, slaves breaking their chains, and tyrants falling from their pedestals. He saw a world remade in fire and blood, with himself as the architect of its transformation. When he woke, the images remained vivid in his mind, and for the first time since leaving Winterfell, Jon allowed himself to dream not just of survival or justice, but of something far grander. He dreamed of thrones. In King's Landing, Tyrion Lannister sat in his solar, a cup of wine in one hand and a collection of reports in the other. The dwarf's sharp mind had been tracking developments in Essos with growing interest, noting how the bastard of Winterfell had begun to reshape the political landscape of the free cities. A wolf with dragons, he mused to himself, studying the latest intelligence, leading an army of freed slaves and sellswords, breaking chains and toppling the established order. It reads like something out of legend. But Tyrion understood that legends had a way of becoming reality when they were backed by sufficient power and will. The reports spoke of a young man who had learned to balance idealism with pragmatism, honor with necessity. More concerning was the evidence of his growing magical abilities and the devotion he inspired in his followers. "The realm watches from across the sea," Tyrion murmured, raising his cup in a mock toast, "and wonders what it means when bastards learn to ride dragons and dream of thrones." The implications were staggering. If Jon Snow truly carried Targaryen blood, as some whispered, then his very existence threatened the careful balance that had kept the Seven Kingdoms stable since Robert's rebellion. A bastard with dragons was dangerous enough. One who had learned to command armies and inspire loyalty was something else entirely. "May the gods help us all," Tyrion whispered to the empty room. "For I fear we're going to need their aid before this tale is done." The legend of the Wolf of Fire spread like wildfire through the free cities, carried by merchants and sailors, slaves and sellswords, anyone who had witnessed or heard tell of Jon Snow's growing crusade. In taverns and marketplaces, in brothels and counting houses, people spoke in hushed tones of the bastard who rode dragons and broke chains. To the slaves he was a figure of hope, proof that their suffering had not gone unnoticed, that someone with the power to change their fate actually cared enough to try. To the slavers he was a nightmare made manifest, an enemy who struck without warning and showed no mercy to those who profited from human misery. But to Jon himself, the legend was both a blessing and a burden. The fear it inspired in his enemies was useful, but the expectations it created among his followers were sometimes overwhelming. They looked to him not just for leadership, but for miracles, for solutions to problems that had no easy answers, for justice in a world that had never known true fairness. "You're becoming something more than human in their eyes," Thoros warned him one evening as they made camp in the ruins of an ancient Valyrian watchtower. "That's dangerous, lad. Gods are expected to be perfect, and perfection is a standard no mortal can maintain." "I'm not trying to be perfect," Jon replied, watching his dragons hunt bats in the twilight sky. "I'm just trying to do what's right. And when what's right conflicts with what's necessary. When you have to choose between saving a few and saving many. When the only path to victory requires you to become the very thing you've sworn to fight against." Jon was quiet for a long moment, considering the questions that had haunted him since the assassination attempt in Saltshore. The boy who had left Winterfell would have had easy answers. Honor above all, justice without compromise, the belief that good intentions were enough to overcome any obstacle. The man he was becoming understood that the world was more complicated than that. Sometimes the right choice was also the hard choice. Sometimes justice required actions that others might call murder. Sometimes saving the many meant sacrificing the few. "Then I'll make those choices," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had already begun to understand the true cost of power. "And I'll live with the consequences, even if it damns your soul." Jon looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, thinking of the dreams that came to him each night, visions of power and glory, of thrones and crowns, of a world remade according to his will. "Maybe damnation is just another price of leadership," he replied. "Maybe that's what separates kings from common men, the willingness to carry that burden so others don't have to." As if summoned by his words, Balefrian and Midera turned from their hunt, landing on his shoulders with the easy grace of creatures born to fly. Their scales were warm against his skin, their presence a constant reminder of the power that set him apart from ordinary men. In the distance, the campfires of his army dotted the landscape like fallen stars, 800 followers and growing, united by a common cause and an uncommon leader. They had chosen to follow him not because of his birth or his bloodline, but because of what he had proven himself capable of achieving. Tomorrow, they would march on another slaver fortress. More chains would be broken, more lives liberated, more enemies added to the growing list of those who feared the Wolf of Fire. And with each victory, Jon's legend would grow, his power increase, his dreams of something greater become more real. He was no longer the bastard of Winterfell, no longer the boy who had left the north with dreams of honor and justice. He was becoming something new, a force of change in a world that desperately needed it, a leader who could inspire devotion and terror in equal measure. He was becoming a king. The only question was what kind of king he would choose to be. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ruins of Ep6, the ancient Dothraki city that Jon Snow had claimed as his seat of power. From the restored tower that served as his solar, the young dragon lord gazed out over the sprawling encampment that had grown around the city's bones, a living testament to what could be built from the ashes of the old world. Saltshore was a good place, peaceful city, not meant for war, and destruction that followed, so he left some loyal men there to keep it safe. At 15, Jon had already lived more lifetimes than most men twice his age. The boy who had left Winterfell with dreams of honor and justice was gone, replaced by someone harder, more calculating, shaped by loss and tempered by necessity. The scars on his body told the story of his transformation. The white line across his ribs from the assassin's blade in Saltshore, the burn marks on his hands from learning to command dragonfire, the calluses from countless hours of sword work and strategy sessions. But it was the scars on his soul that had changed him most. The Ritta perched on his shoulder, her red and gold scales gleaming in the morning light. She had grown considerably since their early days together. Now the size of a small cat, with wings that could carry her for miles and flames hot enough to melt steel. Her brother Balin roosted nearby, his black scales seeming to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. Both dragons watched their master with the intelligent eyes of creatures that understood they were bound to something greater than themselves. "My lord," Sargeras' voice interrupted Jon's contemplation. The grizzled knight entered the solar with the easy familiarity of someone who had earned his place through blood and loyalty. The morning reports. Jon accepted the leather portfolio, without taking his eyes from the window. Below, his army went about its daily routines. Former slaves learning sword work from sellsword veterans. Scouts returning from patrol with intelligence about enemy movements. Engineers working on the fortifications that would make Ep6 truly defensible. 3,000 men now followed his banner. What had begun as a desperate band of outcasts and idealists had grown into a force that commanded respect and fear throughout the disputed lands. They called themselves the Dragon Guard, and they had sworn oaths not to any lord or king, but to the cause of liberation itself. "Casualties from the Quhor raid?" Jon asked, finally opening the reports. "Light. 12 wounded, none dead. The slavers never saw us coming." Garrett's satisfaction was evident in his voice. "We freed 230 slaves, captured enough gold to fund operations for 3 months, and sent another message that nowhere is safe for those who trade in human flesh." Jon nodded, filing away the information with the cold efficiency that had become second nature. Each successful raid added to his growing legend, but more importantly, it added to his resources, men, gold, intelligence, and the intangible but vital currency of fear among his enemies. "And the other matter?" Garrett's expression darkened. "The spy we captured in Norvos broke under questioning. He was working for Magister Urdello, gathering intelligence on our movements and strength. He's been feeding information to our enemies for weeks." The betrayal stung, though Jon had learned not to show such weakness to his subordinates. Trust was a luxury he could ill afford, and every betrayal was a reminder that even among his most loyal followers, there were those who could be bought or coerced. "Execute him," Jon decided, without hesitation. "Publicly, let everyone see the price of treachery." "My lord, he's just a boy, barely 16, pressed into service by threats against his family. He's a traitor who endangered every man, woman, and child under our protection." Jon cut him off, his voice carrying the cold authority that had grown stronger with each difficult decision. "His age and circumstances don't change that fact. Execute him." Gareth bowed his head in acceptance, though Jon could see the discomfort in the knight's weathered features. It was a look he had grown accustomed to, the expression of good men who followed him despite their moral qualms about the choices he made. The execution took place at noon, in the great square that had once been the heart of Vayas Kadok's slave market. Jon stood on the platform where auctioneers had once sold human flesh, watching as his followers gathered to witness justice being done. The irony was not lost on him, using the symbols of oppression to enforce the discipline necessary for liberation. The spies, a thin boy with frightened eyes and trembling hands, knelt before the block with a dignity that Jon found both admirable and heartbreaking. In another life, in another world, he might have shown mercy, but mercy was a luxury that leaders could not afford when the lives of thousands hung in the balance. Let this be a lesson to all who would betray the cause of freedom, Jon declared, his voice carrying across the silent square. We fight not for gold or glory, but for the liberation of the oppressed. Those who would sell that cause for coin or comfort forfeit their right to share in its victory. The sword fell with a whisper of steel through air, and another lesson was written in blood for all to see. Jon felt no satisfaction in the boy's death, but neither did he feel guilt. It was simply another price that leadership demanded, another burden he carried so others wouldn't have to. As the crowd dispersed, Jon noticed the mixture of expressions on their faces: approval from the hardened veterans, uncertainty from the newer recruits, and something approaching worship from the freed slaves who saw him as their deliverer. Each group understood the execution differently, but all of them understood the message: betrayal would not be tolerated. You've changed, Thoros of Myr observed quietly, joining Jon as he descended from the platform. The Red Priest's face showed the weight of years and difficult choices, his once bright eyes now shadowed with concern. The world changed me, Jon replied, echoing words he had spoken before. You helped shape me into what I needed to become. I wanted to make you strong, not this. Thoros gestured at the dispersing crowd, the blood-stained platform, the symbols of power that surrounded them. Every flame casts a shadow, lad. I fear yours is growing darker than you realize. Jon was quiet for a moment, considering the priest's words. There was truth in them. He could feel the darkness growing within him, the cold calculation that made necessary choices easier to bear. But he could also feel the fire that burned alongside it, the passion for justice that had driven him from the beginning. Perhaps, he admitted finally, but shadows are cast by light, not darkness. As long as the flame burns bright, the shadow serves a purpose. And when the flame gutters out, when all that remains is shadow, then I'll have failed, Jon said simply, and someone else will have to carry the torch. The war council that convened that evening was different from any that had come before. Jon sat at the head of a table carved from the black stone of old Valyria, surrounded by representatives of the various factions that had joined his cause. Former slaves who had proven themselves as leaders, sellsword captains who had brought their companies into his service, minor nobles who had been impressed by his growing legend, and even a few former enemies who had seen the wisdom of joining rather than fighting him. The intelligence from our raids has given us a complete picture of the slaving network throughout the disputed lands, Jon began, gesturing to the maps and documents that covered the table. We've broken their primary supply lines, eliminated their most important strongholds, and disrupted their operations from here to the Summer Sea. That's all well and good, Captain Torrhen Blackwater interjected, his scarred face showing the satisfaction of a man who had profited handsomely from their recent victories. But what's our next move? We can't keep raiding forever. No, we can't, Jon agreed, his gray eyes reflecting the candlelight like chips of winter ice. Which is why it's time to think bigger. The disputed lands are just the beginning. He stood, moving to the great map that dominated one wall of the chamber. With a piece of charcoal, he began marking cities and regions, each stroke deliberate and purposeful. Tyros, Myr. The three daughters have grown fat and complacent on the profits of slavery. Their armies are soft. Their defenses outdated. Their people ready for liberation. His voice carried the conviction of someone who had found his true purpose. We take them one by one, break their chains, and add their strength to our own. That's not conquest, Myra Blackwater observed, her dark eyes bright with understanding. That's revolution. Exactly, Jon confirmed. We're not just building an army, we're building a movement. Every slave we free becomes a potential soldier. Every chain we break weakens our enemies and strengthens our cause. The discussion that followed was intense and wide-ranging, touching on logistics, strategy, politics, and the fundamental question of what they were trying to achieve. Some argued for caution, others for immediate action, but all of them understood that they had reached a turning point, the moment when their cause would either grow into something truly transformative or be crushed by the forces arrayed against it. The free cities won't stand idle while we tear down everything they've built, Ser Gareth warned. They'll unite against us, bring in mercenary companies, maybe even hire the Golden Company. Let them, Jon replied with a confidence that surprised even himself. We have something they don't, a cause worth dying for. When the time comes, we'll see which is stronger, their gold or our fire. As the council session concluded and his advisors dispersed to their various duties, Jon remained in the chamber, studying the maps by candlelight. The scope of what he was attempting was staggering, not just the liberation of individual slaves, but the complete transformation of an entire continent's economic and social structure. But as he sat there, feeling the weight of his dragons on his shoulders and the loyalty of his followers like a tangible force, Jon found himself thinking not just of the immediate campaign, but of what might come after. Essos was vast, filled with ancient cities and powerful magisters who would not yield easily. Beyond that lay Slaver's Bay, where the trade in human flesh reached its most grotesque extremes. That night, Jon dreamed. He stood in a vast hall of black stone, its walls carved with the flowing script of old Valyria. Before him stretched an army beyond counting, freedmen and sellswords, former slaves and dispossessed nobles, all united under banners that bore the image of a wolf wreathed in flames. Above them, dragons soared in formation, their roars echoing off the ancient stones like thunder. But it was the figure at the center of the hall that drew his attention. A great black dragon, larger than any that had ever lived, lowered its massive head in a gesture of submission and acknowledgement. Its eyes, ancient and wise, seemed to see into his very soul. You have learned, the dragon spoke, its voice like the rumble of distant earthquakes. You have grown strong, you have become what you were always meant to be. What am I? Jon asked, his voice echoing in the vast space. You are fire, given form, the dragon replied. You are the flame that burns away the old world to make room for the new. You are the wolf who learned to soar. The dream shifted, and Jon found himself standing on a throne of melted swords, looking out over a world transformed. Cities that had once been built on slavery now thrived as centers of free trade. Chains that had bound millions lay broken and rusting, and everywhere the banners of liberation flew in the wind. This is what awaits, the dragon continued. If you have the strength to seize it, if you have the will to pay the price. What price? Everything, the dragon said simply. Your innocence, your peace, your very soul, if necessary. The question is whether you're willing to pay it. Jon woke with the taste of ash in his mouth and the weight of destiny on his shoulders. The dream had been more vivid than any before, filled with a sense of inevitability that both thrilled and terrified him. He could feel the path stretching out before him, leading to heights of power he had never dared imagine. But he could also feel the darkness that path would require him to embrace. The choices that would stain his hands with blood and his conscience with guilt. The boy who had left Winterfell would have recoiled from such a future. The man he was becoming understood that some prices were worth paying. In Pentos, Daenerys Targaryen stood on the balcony of Magister Illyrio's manse, her violet eyes fixed on the eastern horizon where rumors spoke of a bastard with dragons, who was reshaping the world through fire and blood. At 13, she was still more girl than woman. But there was a steel in her spine that spoke of hidden strength. Sister, the Viserys' voice cut through her contemplation like a blade. Her brother stood in the doorway, his pale hair disheveled and his eyes bright with the madness that had been growing stronger with each passing day. Come away from there. We have more important matters to discuss. Do we? Daenerys asked quietly, not turning from her vigil. Or do you simply wish to rant about the bastard who dares to claim our birthright? Viserys' face flushed with anger, but there was fear beneath the rage, fear of a rival he had never expected, whose very existence challenged everything he believed about his own destiny. He is nothing, Viserys snarled. A northern bastard playing with hatchlings. When I reclaim my throne, I'll have his head on a spike. Will you? Daenerys turned to face her brother, studying his features with the calculating gaze she had learned to hide behind a mask of submission. From what I hear, his dragons are growing larger by the day. His army numbers in the thousands. His reputation spreads like wildfire across Essos. Lies and exaggerations.
Are they?
Daenerys interrupted, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made Viserys step back. Or are you simply afraid that the dragon's blood runs stronger in a bastard than it does in a prince? The slap that followed was expected, but Daenerys bore it without flinching. She had learned long ago that her brother's rage was a weakness to be endured, not a strength to be feared. You will not speak to me that way, Viserys hissed. I am the rightful king. You are a beggar living on the charity of others, Daenerys replied calmly, while he builds kingdoms from nothing but will and fire. As her brother stormed from the room, Daenerys returned to her contemplation of the eastern horizon. Somewhere out there, a bastard with dragons was writing his name in history with blood and flame. The question was whether their paths would cross as allies or enemies. She found herself hoping for the former, though she suspected the latter was more likely. The world was not large enough for two dragon riders, with royal ambitions. The Great Assembly took place at sunset, in the amphitheater that had once hosted gladiatorial games for the entertainment of Vais Katakas Dothraki masters. Now it served a different purpose, a gathering place where Jon could address his entire army, where the cause of liberation could be proclaimed to all who would listen. 3,000 men filled the ancient stone seats, their faces reflecting the dying light of the sun. Former slaves sat beside sellsword veterans. Dispossessed nobles shared benches with reformed criminals, and all of them looked to the young man who stood at the center of it, all with the expectant gaze of those who had found something worth believing in. Jon stood on the platform where gladiators had once fought for their lives, his dragons perched on his shoulders like living symbols of power. Brothers, Jon began, his voice carrying clearly through the amphitheater's ancient acoustics. Sisters, comrades in arms and fellow travelers on the road to freedom. We have come far since our humble beginnings, but our journey is far from over. He gestured to the banners that surrounded the amphitheater, the wolf wreathed in flames that had become his personal sigil, the broken chains that symbolized liberation, the dragon heads that spoke of power and ancient blood. We began as outcasts and exiles, bastards and broken men with nothing but our convictions to sustain us. But look what we have built together, an army that strikes fear into the hearts of tyrants, a cause that inspires hope in the oppressed, a movement that grows stronger with each passing day. The crowd stirred, murmurs of approval rippling through the assembled ranks. Jon could feel their energy, their devotion, their willingness to follow him wherever he might lead. But we are no longer a desperate band, he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. We are no longer wolves without a den, scavengers feeding on the scraps of others' victories. We have claimed our place in this world through strength and will, through fire and blood. He paused, letting the words sink in before delivering the declaration that would change everything. We are fire given form, Jon proclaimed, his voice ringing off the ancient stones. We are the flame that burns away the old world, to make room for the new. We are the storm that breaks the chains of oppression, and the light that guides the lost to freedom. The roar that erupted from the crowd was deafening. 3,000 voices raised in approval and acclamation. They stamped their feet and clashed their weapons against their shields, creating a thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ancient city. And fire, Jon continued, when the noise finally died down, will not be denied. The words hung in the air like a promise and a threat, a declaration of intent that would echo across continents. In that moment, standing before his first true host, with dragons on his shoulders and the weight of destiny in his voice, Jon Snow ceased to be merely a bastard durst, ambitions and became something greater, a force of nature, a catalyst for change, a young man who had learned to dream not just of survival but of transformation. Tomorrow, we march, he declared, not as raiders or bandits, but as liberators and conquerors. We march to free the enslaved, to topple the tyrants, to build a world where chains are broken and all men are truly free. The assembly erupted again, but this time the sound was different, not just approval but hunger. The hunger of people who had found a cause worth dying for and a leader worth following into the very depths of hell. As the crowd dispersed and his followers returned to their preparations, Jon remained on the platform, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The boy who had left Winterfell with dreams of honor and justice was gone, replaced by someone harder, more calculating, shaped by loss and tempered by necessity. But the fire that had driven him from the beginning still burned bright, perhaps brighter than ever. It was a flame that would either illuminate the world or consume it, and Jon was no longer certain he cared which. The crown of ash that rested on his brow was invisible to mortal eyes, but he could feel its weight nonetheless. It was the crown of a king who ruled not through birthright or conquest, but through the sheer force of will and the promise of a better world. Whether that promise would be kept or broken remained to be seen. But as Jon Snow stood beneath the stars with dragons on his shoulders and an army at his back, he knew that the time for half measures and compromise had passed. The fire would not be denied, and neither would he. The abandoned estate of House Daenerys squatted in the ruins of what had once been a prosperous holding in the disputed lands, its towers blackened by dragon fire and its walls crumbling from decades of neglect. Jon Snow picked his way through the rubble-strewn courtyard, his boots crunching on broken stone and charred timber as Barrion and the Ugrets circled overhead, their keen eyes watching for any sign of danger. "My lord," Ser Gareth called from the entrance to what had once been the Great Hall, "you need to see this." Jon made his way through the debris, noting the faded banners that still clung to the walls despite years of wind and weather. The three-headed dragon of House Targaryen was prominent among them, though many bore the colors and sigils of houses he didn't recognize. Loyalists who had fled Westeros after Robert's rebellion, seeking sanctuary in the free cities only to find death and disappointment instead. The chamber Ser Gareth led him to had once been a solar or private study, its walls lined with empty bookcases, and its floor covered with the remnants of what had been a considerable library. But it was the iron-bound chest in the corner that drew Jon's attention, its lock broken, and its contents spilled across the floor like the entrails of some great beast. "Letters," Mira Blackwater explained, kneeling beside the scattered documents. Dozens of them, dating back to the final years of Aerys's reign. The chest was hidden behind a false wall. Whoever lived here was very careful about keeping these safe. Jon knelt beside her, his gray eyes scanning the faded parchments with growing interest. Most were written in the flowing script of High Valyrian, though some bore the harsher lines of the common tongue. Names he recognized leaped out at him: Rhaegar Targaryen, Jon Connington, Arthur Dayne, and others who had served the Mad King in the final days before his fall. But it was one letter in particular that made his blood run cold. "The child of ice and fire is safe in the north," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hidden among wolves, protected by honor and love. The dragon's blood runs true, though it flows in bastard veins. When the time comes, when the realm has need, he will remember what he is." The parchment trembled in his hands as he read the words again, each syllable hitting him like a physical blow. The letter was unsigned, but the seal at the bottom bore the image of a harp, the personal sigil of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. "My lord?" Ser Gareth's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you well?" Jon couldn't answer. The world had narrowed to the words on the parchment, to the implications that crashed over him like waves against a rocky shore. "Child of ice and fire." The phrase echoed in his mind, connecting to dreams he had tried to forget, visions that had haunted him since childhood. He thought of Ned Stark's face when he had asked about his mother, the pain that flickered in his father's, no, his uncle's eyes whenever the subject arose. He thought of the way the servants at Winterfell had looked at him, not with the casual disdain reserved for bastards, but with something approaching fear. He thought of Catelyn's hatred, so fierce and unrelenting that it had driven him from the only home he had ever known. Not Ned's bastard, he realized with crystalline clarity. Lyanna's son. The revelation should have brought joy, or at least relief, to know that he was not the product of his father's dishonor, that Ned Stark had sacrificed his reputation to protect him. It should have answered the questions that had plagued him. It should have answered the questions that had plagued him his entire life. Instead, it brought only a crushing weight of understanding. He was not just a bastard, but a bastard with royal blood. Not just Jon Snow, but the son of the crown prince, who had died at the Trident, the heir to a dynasty built on fire and blood, raised by wolves in the cold north. "Burn them," he said quietly, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone in shock. "My lord?" "Burn them all," Jon repeated, louder this time. "Every letter, every document, every scrap of parchment in this cursed place. I want nothing left but ash." "But the historical value," Mira began.
"Is worthless,"
Jon cut her off, his gray eyes blazing with an intensity that made her step back. "These are the fantasies of dead men, the dreams of a dynasty that fell because it forgot that power without wisdom is just destruction with a crown." He stood abruptly, the letter still clutched in his hand. For a moment he stared at the words that had changed everything. then crumpled the parchment into a ball and tossed it into the cold fireplace. "Light it," he commanded. Tyrion descended from his perch near the ceiling, landing on Jon's shoulder with practiced grace. The black dragon's eyes fixed on the crumpled parchment, and a thin stream of flame reduced it to ash in seconds. The other documents followed, consumed by dragon fire, until nothing remained but smoke and the acrid smell of burning parchment. As the flames died down, Jon found himself thinking of Ygritte. Not the dragon who bore her name, but the girl who had died in his arms in what felt like another lifetime. She had always teased him about his brooding, his tendency to dwell on things he couldn't change. "You know nothing, Jon Snow," he could almost hear her saying, her voice carrying the mixture of affection and exasperation that had defined their relationship. Always thinking about what was or what might be, never seeing what is. What would she say about this revelation? Would she laugh at his shock, point out that it changed nothing about who he was or what he had become? Or would she understand the weight of it, the way it reframed every moment of his life in a new and terrible light? "My lord," Ser Gareth said carefully, "the men are asking about our next move. Do we continue the search of the estate?" Jon shook his head, forcing himself back to the present. "No, we found what we came for. Signal a retreat. We return to Viserys immediately." In King's Landing, Tyrion Lannister sat in his solar, a cup of wine in one hand and a collection of reports in the other. The dwarf's sharp mind had been tracking developments in Essos with growing unease, noting how the bastard of Winterfell had begun to reshape the political landscape of the free cities with disturbing efficiency. But it was the latest report that truly concerned him. Whispers from the disputed lands about ancient documents discovered and burned. About the young dragon lord's reaction to whatever he had found among the ruins of Targaryen loyalist estates. "What did you learn, bastard?" Tyrion wondered aloud, taking a long sip of wine. "What truth was so terrible that you chose to burn it rather than face it?" The implications were staggering. If Jon Snow truly carried Targaryen blood, as some whispered, then his very existence threatened the careful balance that had kept the Seven Kingdoms stable since Robert's rebellion. A bastard with dragons was dangerous enough. One who might have a legitimate claim to the Iron Throne was something else entirely. "The realm watches from across the sea," Tyrion murmured, raising his cup in a mock toast, "and wonders what storms are brewing in the east." In Winterfell, Ned Stark stood in the crypts beneath Winterfell, surrounded by the stone effigies of his ancestors. The flickering torchlight cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the carved faces seem almost alive in the darkness. In his hand he held the latest letter from across the narrow sea, a brief report from one of his few remaining contacts in Essos. "The boy has learned about what was meant to be a secret," the letter read, something that shook him to his core. He burned documents at an old loyalist estate, refused to speak of what he found. Whatever it was, it's changed him. Ned's weathered hands trembled as he read the words again. He had always known this day might come, had always feared that Jon would somehow learn the truth about his parentage, the secret he had carried for 16 years, the lie he had told to protect his sister's son, the burden that had cost him his honor and his wife's love. "Lyanna," he whispered to the darkness, "I'm sorry, I tried to protect him, tried to keep him safe. But the truth has a way of finding the light, no matter how deep we bury it." The statue of his sister seemed to watch him with stone eyes, her carved features bearing the same beauty that had started a war and ended a dynasty. She had died in his arms, begging him to protect her son, to keep him safe from those who would see him dead simply for existing. "Promise me, Ned," her voice echoed in his memory. "Promise me you'll keep him safe." He had kept that promise for 16 years, raising Jon as his own bastard, enduring Catelyn's hatred and the whispers of the court. But now the boy knew, the man was beyond his protection, forging his own path in a world that would not hesitate to destroy him if it learned the truth. "What will you do now, Jon?" Ned asked, the empty air. "Now that you know what you are, what will you become?" The journey back to Viserys passed in a blur of dust and silence. Jon rode at the head of his column, his face set in the expressionless mask he had perfected over years of hiding his thoughts from those who would use them against him. His followers sensed his mood and gave him space, understanding that their lord was wrestling with demons they could not see or comprehend. It was only when they made camp for the night that Thoros of Myr finally approached him, the Red Priest's weathered face showing the concern of someone who had watched Jon grow from boy to man. "You're troubled, lad," Thoros observed, settling beside Jon's campfire with the easy familiarity of long companionship. More troubled than I've seen you since Ygritte's death. Jon was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames that danced before him. The fire seemed to whisper secrets, to show him glimpses of possibilities that both thrilled and terrified him. "Do you believe in destiny, Thoros?" he asked finally. "I believe in the Lord of Light's plan," the priest replied carefully. "I believe that some are chosen for great purposes, whether they will it or not. And if that purpose conflicts with everything you thought you knew about yourself, if it demands you become something you never wanted to be." Thoros studied Jon's profile in the firelight, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched unconsciously. "Then you have a choice to make," he said simply. "You can accept what you are and try to shape it to your will, or you can fight against it and be shaped by forces beyond your control. What if what I am is something monstrous? What if the blood in my veins carries madness and cruelty? Blood doesn't determine character, lad. Actions do. I've seen you show mercy to enemies, protect the innocent, sacrifice your own comfort for the good of others. Whatever blood flows in your veins, it hasn't made you a monster." Jon turned to look at his old mentor, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight like chips of winter ice. "But it might," he said quietly. "The capacity for monstrosity is there, Thoros. I can feel it growing stronger every day. The willingness to make hard choices, to sacrifice the few for the many, to burn away everything that stands between me and my goals. That's not monstrosity," Thoros replied. "That's leadership, the willingness to bear burdens others cannot, to make choices others will not. The question is whether you'll use that power for good or ill. And if I can't tell the difference anymore." The priest was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "Then you trust the people around you to remind you," he said finally. "You surround yourself with those who will tell you the truth, even when it hurts. You remember the boy you were and the man you wanted to become." Jon nodded slowly, though the gesture carried little conviction. The boy he had been seemed like a stranger now, someone naive and idealistic, who had believed the world could be changed through honor and good intentions alone. The man he was becoming understood that change required fire and blood, sacrifice and suffering. "She used to tease me about brooding," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ygritte," she said, "I thought too much about things I couldn't change, that I should focus on what was instead of what might be." Jon's lips curved in a bitter smile. "I wonder what she'd say about this." "She'd probably tell you to stop feeling sorry for yourself and get back to work," Thoros replied with a slight smile of his own. "From what you've told me, she wasn't one for self-pity." "No," Jon agreed. "She wasn't." He fell silent again, lost in memories of a girl with red hair and a fierce spirit, who had loved him despite his bastard birth and died because of his failures. The guilt of her death still haunted him, a constant reminder of the price of weakness and hesitation. But now there was another weight to bear, the knowledge of what he truly was, the implications of blood that carried both ice and fire. He was not just Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell, but the son of regular Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, the child of a prince and a she-wolf, born of a love that had started a war and ended a dynasty. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent his entire life feeling like an outsider, a bastard with no true place in the world. Now he learned that he was the heir to the Iron Throne, the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms by blood and birth. But what did that mean for the man he had become? What did it mean for the cause he had built, the followers who looked to him for leadership, the dragons that obeyed his will? In the Red Keep, Lord Varys glided through the corridors like a silk-clad specter, his mind processing the latest intelligence from his network of little birds. The reports from Essos painted a picture of a young man in turmoil, wrestling with revelations that had shaken him to his core. "Interesting," he murmured to himself, settling into his chambers surrounded by maps and coded messages. "The bastard learns the truth about his parentage and burns the evidence. A wise choice, but one that suggests he understands the implications." The spider had suspected the truth about Jon Snow's parentage for years, had pieced together the clues from whispered conversations and careful observations. Ned Stark's honor was legendary, but his sudden appearance with a bastard son after the war had always seemed suspicious to those who knew how to look. "Let's keep Slent for now, and see what choice will the boy make before deciding what to do." "The dragon awakens," Varys whispered to the shadows. "The question is whether it will be a force for order or chaos." The great hall of Vaz Kaidak, had been transformed since Jon's return from the disputed lands. What had once been a ruin filled with rubble and decay was now a functioning seat of power. Its walls hung with banners and its floors cleared of debris. At the center of it all sat a throne carved from the black stone of old Valyria, its surface polished to a mirror shine that reflected the torchlight like captured stars. Jon sat upon that throne now, his dragons perched on the armrests like living symbols of his authority. Before him his war council had assembled: Ser Gareth with his weathered face and soldiers bearing, Meera Blackwater with her dark eyes and moral certainty, Captain Torrhen Blackwater with his scarred features and mercenaries' pragmatism, and a dozen others who had proven themselves worthy of his trust. The raids on the slaver convoys have been successful beyond our expectations, Ser Gareth reported, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. We've freed over 1,000 slaves in the past month, captured enough gold to fund our operations for a year, and disrupted trade routes throughout the region. The enemy response? Jon asked, his voice carrying the flat authority that had become his trademark. Scattered and uncoordinated, Captain Blackwater replied with satisfaction. The Magisters are too busy protecting their own interests to mount an effective counterattack. We've got them running scared. Jon nodded, filing away the information with the cold efficiency that had become second nature. Each successful raid added to his growing legend, but more importantly, it added to his resources: men, gold, intelligence, and the intangible but vital currency of fear among his enemies. But his mind was not truly on the reports or the strategic discussions that followed. Instead, he found himself thinking of the letter he had burned, of the words that had changed everything he thought he knew about himself. Child of ice and fire. The phrase echoed in his thoughts, connecting to dreams he had tried to forget, visions that had haunted him since childhood. He thought of the black dragon that had bowed its head to him in his dreams, of the throne of melted swords that had seemed so real he could feel its sharp edges beneath his hands. Was this what Rhaegar had seen in his visions? Was this the prophecy that had driven the Crown Prince to such desperate actions, the belief in a chosen one who would unite ice and fire in the coming darkness? My lord? Meera's voice cut through his reverie. You seem distracted. Jon forced himself back to the present, noting the concerned looks on his advisors' faces. They had learned to read his moods, to understand when their lord was wrestling with decisions that could affect them all. I've been thinking about our long-term strategy, he said, which was true enough. We've been successful as raiders and liberators. But what comes next? What do we do when we've freed every slave in the disputed lands? We move on to the next region, Ser Gareth suggested. The Dothraki Sea, perhaps, or the cities of Slavers Bay. And after that, do we spend our entire lives chasing slavers from one end of Essos to the other, never building anything lasting, never creating something that will endure beyond our own lifetimes? The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing his advisors to confront the limitations of their current approach. They had been so focused on the immediate goals of liberation and justice that they had not considered what victory might actually look like. What are you suggesting, my lord? Meera asked carefully. Jon stood, moving to the great map that dominated one wall of the chamber. With a piece of charcoal, he began marking cities and regions, each stroke deliberate and purposeful. I'm suggesting that it's time to think bigger, he said, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who had found his true purpose. We've proven that we can free slaves and defeat armies. Now we need to prove that we can build something better to replace what we've destroyed. He turned to face his council, his gray eyes blazing with an intensity that made several of them step back. We're going to conquer the free cities, he declared. All of them. We're going to tear down the old order and build something new in its place. A confederation of free cities where slavery is abolished, where trade is conducted fairly, where power serves the people instead of the other way around. The silence that followed was deafening. His advisors stared at him with expressions ranging from awe to terror, understanding that their lord had just declared war on half the known world. We're not just building an army, we're building a movement. Every slave we free becomes a potential citizen. Every chain we break weakens our enemies and strengthens our cause. The logistics alone, Captain Blackwater began, will be challenging but not impossible. Jon cut him off. We have the intelligence networks, the military strength, and most importantly, the moral authority. When we march on Tyros or Lys or Myr, we won't be coming as conquerors, but as liberators. And if they resist? Ser Gareth asked. Jon's smile was cold as winter steel. then they'll burn. The discussion that followed was intense and wide-ranging, touching on strategy, logistics, politics, and the fundamental question of what they were trying to achieve. Some argued for caution, others for immediate action, but all of them understood that they had reached a turning point, the moment when their cause would either grow into something truly transformative or be crushed by the forces arrayed against it. As the council session concluded and his advisors dispersed to their various duties, Jon remained in the great hall, staring up at the ancient ceiling where dragons had once roosted. The weight of his revelation pressed down on him like a physical force, the knowledge of what he was and what it might mean for the future. He was not just Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell. He was the son of ice and fire, the heir to a dynasty built on conquest and dreams. The blood of kings flowed in his veins, carrying with it the potential for both greatness and madness. But what did that mean for the man he had chosen to become? What did it mean for the cause he had built, the followers who looked to him for leadership, the dragons that obeyed his will? The answer came to him with startling clarity. It meant nothing, and everything. Nothing, because he was still the same person who had made the choice to fight for the oppressed and downtrodden. Everything. Because that choice now carried the weight of destiny, the possibility that he was fulfilling some greater purpose that had been set in motion long before his birth. Child of ice and fire. Perhaps that was what he had always been, even when he didn't know it. The bastard who didn't fit in anywhere, who stood between the cold honor of the North and the passionate fire of the Dragon Kings. The outsider who could see both sides of every conflict, who could balance mercy with justice, idealism with pragmatism. As he sat there in the darkness, feeling the weight of his dragons on his shoulders and the loyalty of his followers like a tangible force, Jon found himself thinking not just of the immediate campaign, but of what might come after. The free cities were just the beginning. Beyond them lay Slaver's Bay, where the trade in human flesh reached its most grotesque extremes. Beyond that lay the Dothraki Sea, where horse lords ruled through strength and terror. The Iron Throne that had been built by his ancestor, Aegon the Conqueror, the realm that had been torn apart by his father's actions and Robert's rebellion, the 7 kingdoms that had never known true unity, true peace, true justice. What would you say now, Ygritte? He thought, remembering the girl who had died in his arms. Would you tell me I'm brooding again? Would you laugh at my grand plans and remind me that I know nothing? But he could almost hear her voice in the darkness, carrying that mixture of affection and exasperation that had defined their relationship. You know nothing, Jon Snow, but maybe that's what makes you dangerous. Maybe that's what makes you free. Free. The word echoed in his thoughts, taking on new meaning in light of everything he had learned. He was free from the constraints of his supposed bastardy, free from the limitations that others had tried to place on him, free to become whatever he chose to be. The question was what he would choose. As the night deepened and the torches burned low, Jon Snow, son of ice and fire, heir to dragons and wolves alike, made his decision. He would not be bound by the mistakes of the past or the expectations of others. He would forge his own path, build his own legacy, create his own destiny. The ashes of the past would nourish the seeds of the future. The old world would burn, and from its flames would rise something new and better. He was fire given form, and fire would not be denied. The revelation of his parentage had not changed who he was. It had simply revealed who he had always been meant to become. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying truth of all.